My name is Sarah Chan, and I've been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 12 years. In that time, I've seen just about everything the wilderness can throw at you. Bear encounters, tourist mishaps, extreme weather, geological events. I thought I'd experienced all the mysteries this ancient landscape had to offer. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago, but I'm only now finding the courage to speak about it. The National Park Service would prefer I stay quiet. My supervisors have made that clear. But after what I discovered beneath the thermal fields of the Norris Geyser Basin, silence feels like complicity. I need to start with some context about my role here as a senior ranger. I'm responsible for backcountry patrols in some of Yellowstone's most remote areas. These aren't the tourist trails where families snap photos of Old Faithful. I'm talking about the deep wilderness zones, places where you might not see another human being for weeks. It's solitary work, but I've always preferred it that way. The park reveals its secrets slowly to those patient enough to listen. The discovery began during what should have been a routine geological survey. We'd been tracking some unusual seismic activity in the Norris area. Nothing major, just some minor ground shifts that our monitoring equipment had flagged. The USGS wanted someone to physically inspect the affected zones, document any visible changes, and collect soil samples. Standard procedure after any seismic event, no matter how small. I set out on a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you remember why you chose to work in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the sulfur scent of the thermal features mixed with the earthy smell of pine needles and decomposing leaves. My GPS coordinates led me to a section about 3 miles northeast of the main Norris Basin. Well off any established trails, the area looked unremarkable at first glance. Rolling meadows dotted with scattered thermal vents, the occasional cluster of lodgepole pines, typical backcountry terrain. But as I began my systematic survey, checking soil temperature readings and photographing the landscape, I noticed something odd. There was a circular depression in the ground, maybe 20 feet in diameter, that didn't match the natural topography around it. Depressions aren't unusual in Yellowstone. The thermal activity creates all sorts of ground instabilities, sinkholes, collapsed thermal features. But this one was different. The edges were too regular, too geometric. It looked almost engineered. I marked the location on my GPS and took several photographs from different angles. Noting the anomaly in my field report, that's when I saw the metal, partially buried in the soft earth. At the center of the depression was what looked like a rusted steel plate. Most of it was hidden beneath decades of accumulated soil and organic debris. But one corner had been exposed, probably by the recent seismic activity. The metal showed signs of significant corrosion, but it was clearly manufactured, not natural. I should have radioed it in immediately. Standard protocol for any man-made discovery in the backcountry is to report it to the district supervisor and wait for further instructions. The park contains countless historical artifacts from Native American sites to remnants of early European exploration. Everything requires proper documentation and handling. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my folding shovel and began carefully excavating around the exposed corner. What I found made my hands stop working for a moment. It wasn't just a random piece of debris. The metal plate was part of something larger, something deliberately buried. The edge I'd uncovered revealed bolt holes and what appeared to be a hinge mechanism. That it was a hatch. I spent the next 2 hours carefully clearing away the accumulated soil and vegetation. The work was slow going, and I had to stop frequently to document my progress with photographs. What emerged was a heavy steel access hatch, roughly 4 feet square, with a wheel-style locking mechanism in the center. The metal was pitted with rust, but the structure appeared sound. Most disturbing were the stenciled markings barely visible through the corrosion. I could make out partial letters, US, and what might have been classified along the edge. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I was looking at some kind of government installation, buried here in one of America's most pristine wilderness areas. The questions started flooding my mind immediately. When was this built? What was its purpose? Why was it here, in the middle of Yellowstone? And most importantly, Why had no one told the current park staff about its existence? I tried the locking wheel, not really expecting it to budge after decades of exposure. To my surprise, it turned with minimal resistance, as if the mechanism had been designed to withstand the elements. The heavy hatch lifted on its hinges with a metallic groan that echoed across the empty meadow. Below was a vertical shaft lined with metal rungs, disappearing into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was stale but not fetid, suggesting some kind of ventilation system might still be functional. I leaned over the opening and called out, listening to my voice echo back from what sounded like a substantial space below. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to close the hatch, mark the location, and radio for backup. This was clearly beyond the scope of a routine geological survey, but the mystery was too compelling. I'd stumbled onto something that had been hidden for decades, something that might explain some of the unexplained phenomena that rangers whispered about but never officially reported. I secured my climbing rope to a nearby tree and prepared to descend into the shaft. The metal rungs were cold under my gloves, and I could feel the temperature drop as I moved below ground level. My headlamp beam revealed smooth concrete walls and what appeared to be electrical conduits running along the sides of the shaft. This wasn't some hastily constructed emergency shelter. This was a serious engineering project. The shaft was approximately 20 feet deep, ending in a small chamber with 3 doorways leading off in different directions. The air down here was cooler but breathable, and I could hear the faint hum of some kind of machinery, electrical equipment, still running after all these years. That realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Someone was maintaining this place. I chose the center doorway and found myself in a corridor lined with what appeared to be office spaces, small rooms with desks, filing cabinets, and walls covered with maps and charts. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but the preservation was remarkable. It was like walking into a time capsule from the 1950s or early 1960s. The maps were what caught my attention first. They showed detailed topographical surveys of Yellowstone, but with markings and annotations I'd never seen on any official Park Service documentation. Grid coordinates, numbered zones, and what looked like drilling locations scattered across the park's most sensitive thermal areas. Red circles marked around specific geyser fields with handwritten notes in the margins that I could barely make out in the dim light. I pulled out my phone to take photographs, but discovered I had no signal this far underground. The concrete and steel construction was blocking any cellular connection. I'd have to rely on my memory and the few physical items I might be able to safely remove. Moving deeper into the facility, I found what appeared to be a laboratory. Stainless steel tables lined the walls, equipped with microscopes, sample containers, and various pieces of scientific equipment I didn't recognize. Shelves along the back wall held hundreds of glass vials, many still containing what looked like soil and rock samples. Each vial was labeled with coordinates that matched locations throughout the park, but it was the photographs pinned to a bulletin board near the lab entrance that made my blood run cold. Black and white images showing thermal features I recognized: Old Faithful, Grand Prismatic Spring, the Norris Geyser Basin. But in these photos, the features looked different, altered. In several images, I could see concrete structures and metal pipes that definitely weren't there now. They'd been experimenting with the thermal features, modifying them. The implications were staggering. I found a manila folder labeled Operation Caldera sitting on one of the lab tables. Inside were dozens of documents, many with official government letterheads: Department of the Interior, U.S. Geological Survey, and some agencies I didn't recognize. The language was dense and technical, but what I could understand was disturbing. The project, apparently active from 1952 to 1967, had been studying the potential for thermal energy weaponization and geological event manipulation. They'd been trying to harness Yellowstone's volcanic system, not for clean energy, but for something far more sinister. The documents referenced controllable seismic events and targeted thermal deployment. They'd been trying to turn Yellowstone into a weapon. One document that particularly caught my attention was a progress report dated March 1963. It described successful small-scale thermal redirections and mentioned plans for full-scale caldera pressure manipulation testing. The report concluded with a recommendation to expand deep-core thermal access points and establish permanent monitoring stations throughout the target zone. Target zone. They were talking about the entire Yellowstone caldera as a target. I photographed every document I could with my camera, working quickly in case someone discovered my unauthorized exploration. But as I moved through the facility, I began to realize that abandonment might not be the right word for this place. Yes, it was covered in dust and clearly hadn't seen regular use in decades. But the electrical systems were still functioning, the ventilation was still working, and in one room, I found a computer terminal that flickered to life when I accidentally brushed against the keyboard. The screen showed a simple text interface, displaying what appeared to be real-time seismic readings from locations throughout the park. Data was streaming in constantly, updating every few seconds. Numbers and coordinates that I recognized as geological monitoring points, but far more detailed than anything the Park Service had access to. Someone was still collecting data from this facility. The project might have officially ended in the 1960s, but something was still active down here. I spent another hour exploring the facility, documenting everything I could. I found sleeping quarters that looked recently used, a kitchen area with food supplies that couldn't have been more than a few months old, and most disturbing of all, a communications room with equipment that looked far too modern for a 1960s. Installation. Radio equipment, satellite uplinks, and computers that clearly belonged to the current decade. This wasn't an abandoned Cold War relic. This was an active, ongoing operation. The realization that I might not be alone down here hit me like a physical blow. I'd been exploring for over 2 hours, making noise, using my headlamp, leaving obvious signs of my presence. If someone was actively using this facility, they would know I was here. I made the decision to leave immediately. I'd gathered enough evidence to raise serious questions with my supervisors, and staying longer would only increase the risk of an unwanted encounter. I made my way back through the corridors to the access shaft, moving as quietly as possible and listening for any sounds that might indicate other human presence. The climb back to the surface felt like the longest 20 feet of my life. Every metal rung could have announced my presence to anyone below. When I finally emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, the normal sounds of the wilderness felt like a blessing. Birds calling, wind in the trees, the distant rumble of a thermal vent. The world above ground seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the sterile tension of the underground facility. I carefully lowered the access hatch and spent several minutes disguising my excavation work. I couldn't completely hide the fact that the area had been disturbed, but I tried to make it less obvious to casual observation. Then I packed my gear and began the hike back to my vehicle, my mind racing with questions about what I'd discovered. The drive back to the ranger station gave me time to process what I'd seen and decide on my next course of action. By the time I reached headquarters, I'd convinced myself that full disclosure was the only responsible choice. Whatever this facility was, whatever ongoing activities it represented, the current park administration had a right to know about it. I requested an immediate meeting with District Supervisor Mike Harrison, a 30-year veteran of the Park Service, who I'd always respected for his integrity and transparency. I laid out everything I'd discovered, showed him the photographs I'd taken, and provided detailed coordinates for the facility location. Mike's reaction was not what I expected. Instead of surprise or concern, I saw recognition in his eyes. He knew about the facility. When I finished my report, he sat back in his chair and studied me with an expression that seemed to be calculating something. "Sarah," he said finally, "I need you to understand that what you've stumbled onto is a matter of national security. This facility and its activities are classified at the highest levels. Your discovery puts both you and the Park Service in a very difficult position." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "You knew about this?" "The Park Service has known about ongoing government operations in the wilderness areas." Mike shook his head. "Not the Park Service as an organization. A very small number of senior administrators have been briefed on certain activities that require access to park resources. It's not something we can discuss openly, even among staff. But Mike, they were experimenting with the thermal features. The documents I saw suggested they were trying to weaponize the volcanic system. That's insane. That's incredibly dangerous. Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. The activities you observed are under the jurisdiction of agencies that operate at levels far above the Department of the Interior. These are matters of national defense that I don't fully understand myself. What I do understand is that unauthorized disclosure of classified operations carries serious legal consequences. The threat was delivered calmly, but it was unmistakably a threat. I was being told to keep quiet about a discovery that potentially affected the safety of millions of people. What about public safety? What about the integrity of the park system? We're supposed to be protecting these resources, not allowing them to be used for weapons research. Mike's expression softened slightly. I understand your concerns, and I respect your dedication to the park's mission. But this is bigger than what either of us can control. The best thing you can do is file a standard geological survey report, note the discovery of historical structures, and let the appropriate authorities handle the classification issues. I left that meeting feeling more disturbed than when I'd emerged from the underground facility. Not only had I discovered an ongoing secret operation in one of America's most treasured landscapes, but I'd learned that the Park Service itself was complicit in keeping it hidden. Over the following weeks, I tried to research what I could about historical government activities in Yellowstone. What I found was fragmentary but troubling. Declassified documents from the 1950s and 1960s revealed numerous instances of military and intelligence agency interest in the park's unique geological features. Projects with names like Operation Hot Spring and Caldera Research Initiative that were heavily redacted but clearly involved extensive study of the park's volcanic system. I also discovered that I wasn't the first park employee to stumble onto unexplained facilities. Over the decades, there had been numerous reports of strange structures, unmarked vehicles, and personnel who couldn't account for their presence in restricted areas. All of these reports seemed to disappear into administrative black holes, with the reporting employees often transferred to other locations shortly afterward. 3 weeks after my discovery, I received new assignment orders. I was being transferred to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, effective immediately. The transfer was described as a promotion, an opportunity to lead a new backcountry preservation initiative. But the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I made one final trip to the hidden facility before my departure. I needed to see if the access hatch was still there, if the underground complex was still active, if any of what I'd experienced was real or just some elaborate stress-induced hallucination. The hatch was gone. The entire depression had been filled in and reseeded with native vegetation, professional landscaping work that made the area look completely undisturbed. If I hadn't taken GPS coordinates and photographs, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that somewhere beneath my feet, the facility was still there, still active, still conducting whatever research had been deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. I accepted the transfer to Great Smoky Mountains, but I didn't stop investigating. From my new position, I began reaching out to other Park Service employees, current and retired, trying to piece together a broader picture of government activities in the national park system. What I learned was disturbing. Yellowstone wasn't the only park being used for classified research. Facilities had been reported in the remote areas of Glacier, Olympic, and several other parks with unique geological features, always hidden, always denied, always resulting in the transfer or retirement of the employees who discovered them. I also learned about Dr. James Morrison, a former USGS geologist who had worked on thermal energy projects in the 1960s. After his retirement, he'd become a vocal critic of what he called reckless experimentation with volatile geological systems. His published papers suggested that certain government research had pushed Yellowstone's volcanic system closer to an eruption state than anyone publicly acknowledged. Dr. Morrison died in a car accident in 1987, shortly before he was scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee about geological safety concerns. In the national parks, 6 months into my new assignment, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a flash drive containing what appeared to be recent surveillance footage from inside the Yellowstone facility I'd discovered. The video showed multiple personnel in laboratory settings, working with equipment that looked far more advanced than what I'd seen during my brief exploration. But what made my blood run cold was the timestamp on the footage. It was dated just 2 weeks earlier. The facility was not only still active, it had been expanded. The footage also showed something else that confirmed my worst fears about the scope of this operation. In one segment, I could see personnel. They were still trying to weaponize Yellowstone. Along with the flash drive was a handwritten note. They know you were there. They know you're asking questions. Be careful who you trust. The Yellowstone project is just the beginning. I've been carrying that warning with me for the past 2 months. I've noticed unusual interest in my activities, both at work and at home. Phone calls that disconnect when I answer. Vehicles that seem to follow the same routes I take. Administrative requests for information about my research interests and contacts in the geological community. I don't know how much longer I can continue this investigation without putting myself in serious danger, but I also can't ignore what I've learned. Somewhere beneath the pristine wilderness of Yellowstone National Park, our government is conducting research that could potentially trigger one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. The Yellowstone caldera is one of the largest active volcanic systems on Earth. When it last erupted 640,000 years ago, it changed the global climate for years. If the current research is attempting to manipulate that system, the consequences of failure or success could affect millions of lives. I'm sharing this story because the public has a right to know what's being done in their name, on their land. With their tax dollars, the national parks belong to all Americans, not to shadowy government agencies pursuing questionable research in secret facilities. I don't know what will happen to me after this account is published. I suspect my career with the Park Service is over, and possibly worse. But I can't stay silent while our most treasured landscapes are used for purposes that could threaten the safety of the entire continent. If you're planning to visit Yellowstone, please be aware that what you see on the surface may not represent the full reality of what's happening in the park. The thermal features you admire, the geological wonders that draw millions of visitors each year, may be part of an ongoing experiment that none of us truly understand. And if you're a current or former Park Service employee who has encountered similar situations, please consider speaking out. The culture of silence that protects these operations depends on our willingness to look the other way. We took an oath to protect and preserve these landscapes for future generations. That oath should include protecting them from reckless government experimentation. I'm writing this from a small cabin in Montana, far from any national park, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wants to disappear, to find somewhere remote where I can forget what I've learned and live quietly. But another part of me knows that silence is complicity. The facility is still there, still active, still pursuing research that could have catastrophic consequences. Someone needs to keep asking questions, even if those questions are dangerous. I hope this account reaches people who have the power to investigate these activities and hold the responsible agencies accountable. Our national parks are supposed to be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of future generations, not used as testing grounds for weapons of mass destruction. Whatever happens to me, I need you to know that the official story about government activities in Yellowstone is not the whole truth. There are secrets buried beneath that pristine wilderness, secrets that affect all of us. I should have left that hatch sealed, but now that it's been opened, we all have to live with the consequences of what's hidden underneath. The truth about Yellowstone is still down there, 20 feet below the surface, humming with electrical activity and guarded by people who will do anything to keep it secret. I pray that someday, someone with more power than I have will find the courage to bring it into the light.